Hey everybody, what's going on? Welcome to the GMI Rocket Show, episode 25 today. My name is Roman Zelchenko. I am your host today. I am an immigration lawyer, the founder of Laborless, an immigration tech startup that automates H-1B compliance, and GMI Rocket, which brings you this show. I'm super excited for today's episode with my friend and fellow immigration marketer, Maneesha Mukhi. And we're going to get into Maneesha's story, but basically Maneesha is not an immigration lawyer, but somebody who knows as much as an immigration lawyer because she went through the immigration process more than almost anybody I know. A whole bunch of H-1B visas, green card process for years, finally got her citizenship. And throughout that whole process, Maneesha's entrepreneurial mind took over and she was like, we need to have more and better information out there in the world. She's built two businesses that create content for the immigration space, and now is basically a YouTube expert supporting other people, but specifically immigration lawyers as well, helping them create really awesome and successful YouTube pages. We're going to get into all that, but thank you, Maneesha, so much for joining me today. And I'm excited to hear more about your story and compare entrepreneurial immigration marketing notes.
Hi. Hey, Roman. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Thank you. We've known each other for a little bit, but as with all these episodes, sometimes when I know people who are on the show, like we've had a chance to talk, but I feel like it's never one of those things where, you and I might meet up and I'm like, all right, Maneesha, let's talk about your life for an hour. Tell me everything. So, I'm excited to, hear and learn a lot about kind of your whole journey, right? Like your whole journey of being in the U.S. as sort of a foreign national going through the immigration process, and as an MBA, kind of how and when that transformed into just a business idea. Where are you calling in from now, by the way?
I am in Brooklyn, New York.
Nice.
Not too far from you.
Yeah, and typically I would agree, but I'm actually in upstate New York right now, kind of enjoying the woods, getting away from the city for a little bit.
I hear you. I did a little bit of that this summer too.
Nice. Yeah. How's COVID going in New York City now that I'm away for like the week?
I lay low, so honestly not that different to me. I walk my dog, occasional grocery store trip, but otherwise I lay low. I'm in this laptop all day long mostly, and I feel I work more now than ever.
I feel the same way. It's been so long since everyone's kind of been working from home. It's still kind of hard, I feel like, to really separate life and work when everything you're doing is from home.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Before we kind of jump into everything, I just want to say for folks who are listening and tuning in, number one, sorry we're a couple of minutes late. I'm calling in from this. My background's different today. I'm calling in from upstate, so took a couple of minutes to get in. But don't forget, leave comments, shout out where you are right now. I wonder if anyone else is in a little cabin shacked up in the woods. That would make me feel better. Shout out where you are, and of course, as we go, leave comments, questions. We'll ask them and kind of talk through them as we go through the conversation with Maneesha. Samir's already asking, am I going to cook up a meal? This is a sweet stove. This is a way better stove than what I have at home in Queens for sure. So trust me, I've been half on vacation and half just enjoying kind of like all of the nice, cool toys in this house. All right, but we're not here to talk about cooking. Maneesha, I think I was doing a little bit of research, and obviously from the conversations we've had in the past, you came to the US, but from what I read, and I don't know that I knew this about you, you were born in India, but you weren't raised there in the sense that many other people were, and then you came here for college. You actually moved around the world a lot, right? After you were kind of born, you left India and moved around the world. Can you share a little bit about that? Like, what's that all about?
Yeah, actually, I wasn't born in India. I was born in Paris, France. And I lived in India very briefly, about maybe 3.5 years of my life. And some of it was as a child, and then some of it I did 8th and 9th grade in India. But outside of that, my father was a diplomat for India. And so we moved to a different country every 3 years. So, being an expat / immigrant, I mean, it's all I've known my whole life. So I grew up in 6 countries. I primarily went to international schools, and so I went to school with kids from all over the world. But yet, many of us chose to come to the U.S. after we were done for school. It was the place to go for higher education. So I'd say the majority of people I went to school with eventually landed in the U.S. And so I came here when I was 18, which was now back in 2000, which tells you all how old I am. And so I came here on a student visa about 20 years ago.
Did you said you grew up in 6 countries. I'm assuming France and India are 2 of them.
Yes. And then there was South Korea, Cote d'Ivoire in West Africa, Switzerland. I think I'm forgetting one. I'm blanking out. No, I think that was it. Is it 5, 6? I think I'm forgetting it. Oh, Belgium, and also Belgium.
Got it. Wow, that's so cool. And do you, not to go through an exact timeline, but where were you kind of a teenager?
Yeah. So I think I'd say some of my formative years were in West Africa, India, and Switzerland, right?
Wow.
So because I spent the ages of high school was in Switzerland, in the German-speaking part of Switzerland, in the capital, in Bern, and 8th and 9th grade was in India, which quite honestly, my parents are Indian. We grew up, I grew up with Indian culture. I knew the Indians we knew in every country were usually the Indians that worked in the embassy. But still going to India, and even though I went to India every year, going to school in India was a bit of a culture shock.
Wow, interesting. Were your parents kind of adamant about making sure that you sort of had cultural, infusion during your life, regardless of where you were in the world?
I wouldn't say adamant, and honestly, it's quite easy. My mother doesn't speak English very well, so as a result, I did know Hindi before English, and in fact, I knew Hindi and French before I learned English. I learned English when I was 5, and then I forgot all my French until later in life when I ended up in a French-speaking country. So, I think language is a very, strong tie to your culture, and along with food, and so whether you live in India or abroad, there are some core things that I feel all Indian families do. So, I felt very multicultural though. I did feel like I was European, and now that I've been here for 20 years and I recently became a citizen, I'm also very American. And yes, it took a hell of a long time to become a US citizen.
Wow, that's so crazy. Do you have any, I guess because you went to international school, did you go to school with other folks who were of Indian descent, or was it all sorts of people who were part of sort of ambassador families that were there?
Yes. So, the majority of kids I went to school with, their parents were either diplomats or they were entrepreneurs who were living in these countries. So very few Indians actually, other than, usually the mission in a country, the embassy, the size of it depends on the country. And so, but in, many of these countries, we knew maybe 8 total families that were Indian, maybe 10 at best. Wow. And maybe they had kids that were around my age. So really the majority of my years, I had no more than maybe 1 or 2 students in my class that were also Indian. So literally everything. I went to school with kids from 50 countries.
Wow. That's so cool. Did you pick up French when you were living in Cote d'Ivoire, or?
I already knew some French because I went to a French nursery school for a year before I went to kindergarten. So I knew a little bit of French. And then when I ended up in Cote d'Ivoire, which was 4th grade, then, it became a little more native again. And now I'm back to being rusty after being here for 20 years.
Right. Yeah, it makes sense. Well, listen, at least you had that experience. A lot of folks speak 1, maybe 2 languages tops, and the fact that you've had exposure to and lived in all these countries it's so cool. It also, I feel like, maybe a little bit of foreshadowing, but once you work in the immigration space in any capacity, having that international experience, even if you've never been an immigrant, quote unquote, just living abroad and studying abroad, just even traveling and seeing other cultures, I feel like is so impactful and creates a huge sense of empathy for clients who are going through immigration processes. But we'll get to that. And I feel like we can do a whole episode about your adventures kind of prior to 18 years old, because that's so cool. So you moved here when you were 18 years old to study, to go to university. And I think I read that you went to Gettysburg College, right, in Pennsylvania. Yeah. And what did you study there again?
Economics and business management. yet.
Got it. Right. What was that? What was that like coming from just being abroad your whole life in a sense, or moving around to, finally, okay, 4 years at university
I feel like I fit right in. But I will say, it was very different in the sense that Gettysburg College, it's a liberal arts college, but it's extremely white, right? So there wasn't much diversity on campus. I was maybe one of 45 international students out of 2,300 students. And so it's a small college, not a lot of diversity. But I really loved it. And actually, quite honestly, I feel like I assimilated pretty instantly because I really wanted to, right? I really wanted the full American college experience. I love that we could take all kinds of classes. I love the liberal arts environment. But at the back of my mind, even when I started college, I knew that when I graduated, I wouldn't have the same options that everybody else did because of the H-1B visa and like the restrictions. So part of the reason I pursued economics and business was, it'll help me get an H-1, right? I was honestly really interested in linguistics and things that would never get me an H-1. And so, while I was in college, I was thinking, well, if I want to stay and contribute to this country, I need to either go into, computer engineering or mathematics or something that is of need in the workforce here.
What, just, it's kind of a small backtrack, but what was your experience like getting because you came here in F1, I presume, right? Because your family wasn't here. It's not that you were studying as a family member of a diplomat. You came here F1.
Yes, and I had no family here. And honestly, I had a much easier time actually applying for and getting the student visa because of my dad's job, because he was a diplomat. Mm-hmm. Like he came with me to the US Embassy, and as a result, like he knew the visa officer, and it was a really friendly conversation. And it was like they asked me 2 questions and the visa was approved. Now, my friends who've gone through this experience around the same time I did, actually, I didn't know her at the time. I met her in Gettysburg College. She later became my first roommate out of college. She had been rejected for F1 student visa like 4 times.
Wow.
Because for whatever reason, she couldn't prove strong ties to India, which her entire family was in India, right? There was no reason. So it's very challenging. For many students, they get to their interview, they've been accepted, they've gotten scholarships or their families are funding it, and convincing a visa officer that you only want to come to the US for college and nothing else, right? It's very counterintuitive because you'd want these students to come here and hopefully continue afterwards and contribute. Like this is where a lot of our great companies are formed, and but if a visa officer has any inkling that you might want to stay afterwards beyond like your OPT, that you get, they'll reject your visa.
Wow.
So it's very confusing. Like, and you're 18 years old, or not even at this point, 17, and you just want to come here to study, right? So most people aren't thinking like, for the next 10 years, this is what I want to do. But if you happen to slip and say, yeah, I want to stay for the next, for 5 more years afterwards, that's like a red flag to a visa officer, mm-hmm. right?
It's crazy because you'd think that for students, especially, I mean, you're going to pay a ton of money to go to school. You went through the whole process with the US-based institution. Yeah, to your point, you'd think that the government would just say, of course, come right in. We want you.
Well, especially given our shortages, right? Like STEM students, especially, the US just doesn't produce enough STEM graduates. So, after I came here, a long time after I came here, they finally extended the STEM OPT to be longer. And I thought that was a really positive step. And I haven't seen a lot of positive changes in immigration in the last 20 years I've been, but that was one of them,
mm-hmm. So when you studied, you got your F1, and then you had your OPT. So I guess because you're an econ major, how long was that OPT for back then? Was it a year?
Yeah, it was a year. Back then there was no H-1B lottery. Mm-hmm. So as soon as I found an employer where I could work on my OPT, we maxed out my OPT, but with HR and our lawyer, we figured out the right time to apply for my H-1, and there was no worry that I wouldn't get it, right? Wow. At that time, it was more first come, first serve, and so they weren't worried. Now it's like, oh, well, you have 1 chance, and if you don't, you have a 1 in 3 chance, depending on how many petitions they get, of actually getting the H-1, right? So, and if you're a STEM OPT person, then you have maybe 2 or 3 chances because you have a little more time, right? But this concept of having a certain, back then it was if you had an employer that could sponsor you, you were okay. You'd be able to stay as long as you were employed and, contributing to society.
That's just another world compared to what it is now, because it's so competitive and scary for a lot of people, confusing and frustrating, especially folks who go to undergraduate, they don't get their H, they go back to grad school for another 2 to 4 or 5 years. I mean, master's, PhD, and still at the end of all of that, spending all the money and spending all that time and sometimes getting married, buying a home or what have you, you still don't know what's going to happen. Just the thought of a world where it was like not an if, but rather an when you get that job sounds almost like a dream.
Yeah, but don't get me wrong. It was still really hard to get a job that would sponsor you. So, I think what happened with me is I got through a bunch of like second, third round interviews at companies. Because I have an American accent, a lot of them didn't think to ask me if I had the legal authorization to work in the US beyond like OPT. And I had offers rescinded as soon as they realized I was not a green card holder. And so that was pretty painful. Like I had the jobs and they took it away from me.
Wow.
And so, there are companies that just have a policy of not doing it because it's expensive, it's prohibitive. And then there are companies who just recognize that it's really hard to find certain types of talent and they're willing to, like no one would spend this kind of money if they didn't have to. I think that's the point that people miss about H1 when they talk about people stealing jobs and things like that. Like, why would a company go through this trouble if they didn't really need to?
Yep, absolutely.
Right?
It's expensive. It's not just the filing fees, it's the legal fees, it's the administrative fees on the company's side. It is not cheap or easy necessarily to hire an H-1B worker, but it's like when you need to, that's what you do.
Right. And it's a risk for a company, right? Especially under this administration where when you're renewing H-1Bs and, extending them, they're being adjudicated as if they were brand new petitions and you could potentially just lose your employee overnight because it didn't get approved, right? So it's been particularly challenging, I think, in the last 4 years. My heart really goes out to folks who, are just doing their jobs and
right.
Because it hurts both the employers and the employees. I think that's what people don't realize.
Absolutely. And so you got your H-1B job out of college, which is awesome. And then you eventually went to graduate school, right? You went to University of Chicago Booth School of Business to get your MBA. What prompted you to do that?
I honestly think it's my Asian roots. Further education, it is what you do. And I was like, what's the next step in my career? And I look around me and people like me were getting their MBAs. And I was a little young to go get an MBA. I was still 24 when I enrolled, but I also did it part-time. So I did it at night while I continued to work. And again, the main reason for my doing that was immigration. I didn't want to get off my H1. And in retrospect, that was a really good decision because it's around that time that the lottery came about, the H-1B lottery. So the reason I did school at night was so that I could stay on my H1. Otherwise, I would have preferred to have gone to school full time. But no, I think for me, it was a stepping stone to the next phase of my career because I did notice there was a ceiling. I was interested in management consulting. The top firms do not look at you without a master's. And so that was really what prompted it. I think I wanted to pivot my career a little bit. And the only way to really do so was to go back to school.
And so after you graduated, so you weren't, you were thinking when you were in school, I want to get a management consulting job. Of course, some of the most prestigious jobs in the world. You landed that job, right? You worked, and where did you work when you graduated?
I worked at Booz & Company, which has since been acquired. So it's not called Booz & Company. It's gone through a few name changes, but back then it was Booz & Company.
Yeah.
And I worked there for a little over 3 years. And, it was grueling, but it was a really good experience. And most importantly, it's where I finally got my green card because I had started my green card process at 3 different companies. And because each time I switched jobs, the jobs were different enough that this old application no longer it didn't make sense and it wouldn't work. So I kept starting my green card over and over. And at this point, I was on my fifth year of the ending of my fifth year of my H1. And so this is interesting. The company had to start my green card process before I actually started working for them. It was the only way I could stay in the country because you have to file for that green card before you start your sixth year or you run out of time. And so when they made me an offer, I said, hey, I know this is unusual, but I can start in March, but you have to file my paperwork in January before I start for my green card. And typically the company's policy was they didn't start your green card until you've been working with them for 1 year. So in my case, they waived that. So see, this is also a little bit of luck, right? That this company really wanted to employ me and they waived their 1 year policy so that I could work for them. So I feel like immigration is also sometimes being in the right place at the right time. And I think for me, this was that right time that someone was willing to do that for me. They could have just been like, we'll get another person. There were other graduates they potentially could have hired.
That's amazing. That is, and it's tough because on the one hand, it means that you should try to apply for as many jobs as possible and put yourself out there as much as possible. But, it is frustrating to think that luck has to play some role in this, right? Especially now. So you got that green card. So at this point, just to understand, you had 5 different H-1Bs or 4, I guess?
I believe 4.
4 H-1Bs. Wow. And then 2 and 3 green card applications.
It was a third. Well, one of the 2 green card applications before, I was working for ABN AMRO and the bank got acquired. And when it did, I knew my group would become obsolete. And so I left before I got laid off because getting laid off in an H1 is a really terrible thing so as soon as I knew we were being purchased, I started looking for another job.
Wow.
Right. So again, I had a little bit of time, very little, but I had a few months to plan for that.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's really smart. I mean, that's one of those strategic things where, it's great that you had that. And I would think that H-1B holders now who are going through something like that would really benefit from reading or hearing your story to think, if something's happening, how can this potentially impact my H-1B in a way that I'm not thinking about right now? And, what steps can I take to sort of counter that? So you got your green card with Booz, and you worked there for some time. And then I know that you went off into sort of working for more smaller companies, startups. I'm curious, just from not even from an immigration standpoint, but from a business standpoint, what made you make that change, right? Because it sounds like you could have just kept on going down the management consulting route, finished up the whole green card process and kind of taken that career as far as it can go, which is a really incredible career. But here we are talking, and you're, the founder of multiple companies, and you've kind of really made this pivot. I'm curious, what made you change the trajectory of your career? And when was there a time or an inkling when you started to think, I want to create something, and I want to create something that solves a problem that I've sort of experienced myself? I mean, do you remember that moment?
Yeah, I think I've always craved a creative outlet, and I think I did feel a little boxed in because of the H1. Like, while I enjoyed consulting, I also burnt out. I was exhausted. I was working, 90-hour weeks. I was on the road every single week. I was burnt out. So I didn't think I could stay in that job forever, maybe another couple more years, but I just couldn't do it anymore. But what I really enjoyed while I was there was I loved being on new projects every 3 months and every 4 months and learning new things. And so I did like that fast pace, and I loved absorbing new information and learning new things. And so when I got my green card, though, the first thing I did, honestly, I quit shortly after, but I actually went to a nonprofit first, because the one thing that had been missing in my life that I really enjoyed, and I tried to do it on the side by volunteering, social impact work was really important to me. And that's really outside of my personal immigration stuff. How I actually got into immigration as a profession was I worked at an immigrant nonprofit in New York called Saki. And they advocate and help domestic violence survivors of the South Asian community here in New York, right? And so these are primarily low-income women living in the New York area of South Asian descent. And so Here, we helped them with a variety of problems, one of which was their immigration status. So I used to translate for immigration lawyers for these women and help them fill out their immigration forms and, just connect them to other resources that they needed to get out of their difficult situations. And so I did that for a year, thinking I wanted to go get a master's in social work. But I realized, okay, I'm on the right path. I really like immigration, but this is not quite it. And it happened to be that I got this startup opportunity to go work at a brand new startup as like their chief of staff. I could carve out basically whatever role I wanted for myself. And that's a pretty rare opportunity to get. And it was retail technology. And so I went and did that for a year, and it was really fun, really exciting. I actually ended up working at 2 startups at the same time. And much of what I learned in that second startup is what I applied to AskEllis, because that other startup was also a marketplace, just in another industry, right? So I learned a lot about how to get a marketplace up and running. And so I applied quite a bit of what I learned there to when I first started AskEllis. But with that said, AskEllis came afterwards. Somewhere at some point while I was at those 2 startups, I started craving my own thing. And while the startup work was cool, I realized I'm just not that interested in retail, right? Like, it's not my passion. I think at the end of the day, serving a community or serving others and helping underserved people, I was just much more passionate. And I think I've craved roots for so long, my whole life. Like, immigration is so deeply embedded in me that I found myself gravitating back towards that. And also because people kept asking me questions about immigration and legal questions. And I'm not a qualified attorney. I'm not an attorney at all. And so that got me thinking, like, why are they asking me? Isn't there a better way to, access information? And I found that, I'm pretty resourceful. So I was able to piece together a lot of things, but there was nothing out there piecing together information like that for people back then. Today, the immigration tech space is so much more exciting. There's so much more going on. None of these resources were available 15 years ago, right? So the only thing that was available to find a lawyer was Avo. And Avo is daunting. There are thousands and thousands of lawyers on there. There are still some bad lawyers on there. So how do you know who's a good lawyer? How do you know if the information you're Googling in those forums, what in it is accurate or not accurate, right? So that's really what culminated and kind of pushed me to start AskEllis.
So before we jump into what your sort of first iteration of AskEllis was, it sounds like people were coming to you for immigration questions because they clearly knew that you went through the process. And of course, you worked at the nonprofit and you were part of helping individuals with their immigration process as well. Now, when you said you would send them, I suppose you'd give them information, were you typing things up for them? Were you sending them links? Were you sending them videos? Like, if someone came to you at that time and said, Maneesha, I don't understand what to do with my green card, right? Where can I look? What would you do that wasn't out there otherwise?
Well, for starters, I think because I was at Saki, I formed some great relationships with a few immigration lawyers, one of which I actually hired for my own stuff. And so, when people reached out to me, if it was something that I thought needed to be spoken with an attorney, I would actually refer them to one of those attorneys who I knew and trusted, right? And I think that is how most people find their attorneys, is through referrals. But I think I unofficially started building in my head like a database of attorneys I knew. And if it was something more simple or something I had experienced, because I'd been, I transferred H1 so many times, I went through the green card. If it was something I could lean on my own experience, I'd be like, hey, I know the answer to this. Let me share my experience with you, or do that. Also, I would go on government websites and all kinds of websites and just piece together information and send it to people.
So you were kind of ad hoc answering folks' questions and spending really your time answering their questions. Yeah.
And a lot of them started calling me Manoogle because they were like, oh, we don't need to Google, we'll just Manoogle. And so, it got me thinking, like, I felt like an algorithm of sorts, but it was very manual, right? I was doing it just to help people. I had a day job. It wasn't like, I knew the pain of the stress and anxiety that comes with immigration. And sometimes you can't ask your lawyer those questions either. So for example, if you're working for a company and you want to leave that company, the corporate immigration lawyer is working in the best interest of the firm. So if you have a bunch of questions about leaving the firm and maintaining your status, you're not going to ask your firm immigration lawyer, right? So that's when I would recommend people talk to some of the lawyers I knew. So sometimes even when you have a lawyer, you may want to talk to a different lawyer. Or sometimes, and I got this too, lawyers screwed up and they needed to find a better one, right? So, and that's really what got me thinking about, hey, how does someone find a good lawyer without getting overwhelmed?
Yeah, I mean, totally. And people trusted you, and it makes sense that if someone you used was successful, then the likelihood that they'd be successful for that person is probably pretty high as well. I'm curious, before we kind of jump in, because I really want to know about, all right, what was the first thing you did when you said, I'm going to start AskEllis? And actually, before it was AskEllis, it was Imigo. I think when we met, it was still called Imigo.
Before Imigo, it was actually something else. It was Border. It was Border Gab, which was a terrible name, but I had name fatigue and I just went with it.
So before we jump in there, I just want to point out a couple of comments. So Samir says, but before we were chatting about how expensive it is to actually hire an H-1B, the idea that companies are spending a lot of money and resources to hire these folks. I mean, that should indicate, and it really does indicate, that they truly need these people. And not enough people, I think, talk about that, which is really what Samir is saying. Maria Washington, thank you for the comment. Sounds very interesting. So thank you, Maria. And then we have Anshu says, yes, absolutely, right time, right place. I mean, I think with life in general, that's probably the case, but certainly with immigration, when time is a little bit more of the essence.
Yeah, absolutely.
So thank you for the comments, and guys, keep, share more comments wherever you are. Let us know where you're from. I'm always want to take a pause and just say, shout people out who are watching and kind of contributing. So Maneesha, I guess at this point you're working at a couple of nonprofit startups. You've had the nonprofit experience. I've been there too, where I've worked at multiple startups at the same time. You really learn so much because you move so quickly that you have to learn, and you're wearing multiple hats. I know my story of when I decided to break off, and I started doing it at night and building things out. And only when I felt really that I needed more of my day time to take next steps with what I was building, in particular Laborless, that's when I left my job. How did it, what was the thing that you first did when you first built, what now is AskEllis? What was that kind of first step you took?
Yeah. And actually, if I were to go back, I don't think I would have left my job that quickly, so I think this, in hindsight, you hear a lot in the start. When you think of the startup community, you think of fundraising and building like a, billion-dollar business. And, you're not going to get funded if you're not fully dedicated to your startup. And so I was under the impression I needed to do it full time to be taken seriously. And I don't think that's true at all. So I think when I felt I was losing passion and interest where I was, I left. But I could have very easily done what I did on the side for the first 6 months instead of, because what happened is I was working on it for the first 6 months and I was like, I could have had an income and done this on the side, right? Like I was spending a lot of time, but coming from consulting, I was used to working 80, 90 hours. So I don't think I could have easily done what I was doing at the other company while spending 20, 30 hours a week building this up. And so, and I think, look, like any startup founder, I was flailing a bit. I was like, okay, I need to incorporate this business. I need to build a website. I had some sort of vision of what I wanted. I'm not a techie, right? So in those days, I was like, okay, how do I build a website? Because it wasn't just a cookie cutter website. I wanted a marketplace, a two-sided marketplace where people could search through filters and find certain types of lawyers. And so, I wasted a lot of time and energy in the wrong resources. Like I hired someone that was terrible and gave me this crappy website. And so more than the money, it was time down the drain. So a lot of those first 6 to 9 months was spent just figuring this out. The logistics of it, because I was very clear on what I wanted to build and what type of experience I wanted to build up. But how to bring that to life was not, it was the first time I was doing it. And yes, I'd worked at other startups, but I was working with like other people and people who had experience, who had come from other startups, right? So this time I was just me. I was all on my own. And early on, you bootstrap, you do it yourself. When is the right time to hire? I grappled with, do I want a founder, a co-founder or not? Like, does it make sense to get a CTO? So there was a lot of that in the first year.
So what was this, just for the folks listening especially, what was this initial vision that you wanted to build out?
Yeah, so initially, I think the reason I called it Border Gap was content was always at the forefront of my mind. I initially wanted to build a content platform, a really robust one, because back then we didn't have all the legal websites we have now. There was no NOLO and any of that, right? So I wanted to build a robust content website that had the types of questions people were asking for, because, no matter where you are in immigration in your journey, whether you're just starting or in the middle, you have questions and you may or may not have a lawyer to reference. And so that was the initial intention, along with a small portfolio of vetted immigration lawyers, right? And initially I wanted to start in New York because immigration law is federal. So I figured, if I focus my energy in one geography, I could probably make a lot of difference with even just 20 lawyers to start with. And as I did better, the intention had been to grow it to various other cities. And I never ended up doing that. I never ended up expanding into other cities. I never really felt the need to do that. And demand was fairly inconsistent in the early months, which is why I gave the service away for free to the immigration attorneys, because it was, they were taking a chance on a new company. And so they let me be their guinea pig, and I was able to test out a lot of things with the first set of lawyers. And so that really was the vision. And I don't think it's changed that much. I think the plans I had for future expansion, I did change along the way.
And so when you say that you gave it away, just to clarify, really what happened was you were building content. If I understand you correctly, you were building content. Content was answering really specific questions, a lot of questions that folks who are going through various stages of the immigration process had. And the idea was that they would Google these questions. You would come up effectively. I mean, it's search engine optimization, right? Your answers would come up. They'd come in, they'd read the answers to their question, they'd read this article, they'd get all the information. And then somewhere within, or multiple times within an article, it's like, hey, do you need a lawyer? Yes. If you do, we have a group of vetted lawyers, like you said, a portfolio of vetted lawyers who can help you. And when you say that you gave it away for free, I guess what you're saying is, or maybe this was in the beginning, you went to your lawyers and said, look, I want you to be in my portfolio, and I'm not going to charge you. What's going to happen is you're going to be in my portfolio. As people go through my content, it is very likely that some of them are going to reach out to you and you will get the business.
Yes. And as a non-lawyer, I couldn't have the type of model where I could take a commission, because that's the most logical model, is pay per performance in this case. But because I couldn't do that, my intention had been to charge an annual subscription fee, which even if you got one client or two, it would more than make up for being part of the network. And so that was the initial intention. And I didn't, and like I said early on, demand was very inconsistent. But the other thing was, I got a ton of queries. I didn't just necessarily always send them to the lawyers. So that's the thing, generating organic traffic on Google is really hard as a legal or health website, right? The algorithm treats you a little differently because the cost of misinformation is so high when it comes to law and health. And so the algorithm is harder on these websites, right? And I'm sure other industries as well, but I really only know about legal and health sites. And so because of that, ranking was really, really hard organically. So I'd say at my best, I had about 10,000 people coming to the site a month. And the thing with Google is it's not just, you don't just create SEO friendly content and just slap it up there and it'll keep working for you. You have to continually refresh that content. Google looks at how often, your content, how recently you're putting, whether it's new content or refreshing old content. So it is a lot of work. And, eventually my frustration with Google is what led me to start on YouTube. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But that is where all the leads came from early on. It came from within my own network because people knew I was doing this. And, I guess the pitch to the immigration lawyer was, look, I'm going to screen out all the queries you don't need to take. Because I think that's the other, because what's in it for lawyers, right? Other than getting clients, is that so many people want your time for free. And if lawyers spend all their times giving free consultations, when would they actually do any work and make any income for themselves, right? Yes, people become immigration lawyers to serve others, but they also have to earn a livelihood. So I did get thousands of queries, but a lot of times, I'd say less than 30% of those queries I actually sent over to lawyers. So because a lot of those queries could be answered with blogs or with basic information, or they were just not a good fit, or they didn't have the means to, in which case I'd help them find a pro bono attorney. So I would direct them to another organization in that case. And so there was a lot of that happening in the back end, which I think was of great value. But all of this was very manual, and I was trying to figure out how to scale this and make it operate more efficiently. And so I think that's where I really got stuck on advancing this marketplace.
And so, just for my own personal interest from a business standpoint, you ended up making some money off of this, right? Because this was your full-time job. This was your company.
But at no point did I feel like it was a sustainable business that would stand alone, continue this way for many more years. And that's part of why I then started leaning into other ventures. And I've always been someone who's done multiple things, I invest in the stock market and other things like that. So I had other little side things, but at no point was this, a sustainable business model where I was like, okay, I see where this is going, and this can, in 10 years be at this stage. And the things I would have to do to make it that way, I didn't want to. So that was the other thing. I didn't want to be the next Apple. Right. I realized that, yes, you could have a small network of high quality lawyers, but it couldn't be too small. It would and then I felt I would lose some of that quality and high caliber aspect. Whereas right now I know all the lawyers in the network. The larger you get, it's very hard to continue to do quality control. Yes, you get reviews. Yes, you get testimonials. You can do yearly check-ins and things like that. But it gets complicated very fast.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is kind of the Avo model in a sense, but it's niche, and it's, I guess, more white glove. And because it sounds like you were a layer between these individuals and the lawyers, you kind of vetted them almost personally when they had an inquiry.
Yeah, and that was the challenge, was how do I replicate myself, right? Mm-hmm. I thought about it. Do I hire 3 people and train them so that, but then I realized they would have to at least be paralegals and have some immigration background at the very minimum, right? So it was how do you scale this level of white glove service that, to degree? And I don't know if you remember, maybe it was 5 years ago, there was a company called Shop Immigration, mm-hmm. and they've evolved into something different now. But in the beginning, they too were a marketplace. And I think they spent a whole year, they signed up 200 lawyers, and they came to the same conclusion that, financially it wasn't a viable business model, and it was really hard to control quality. So, today I believe they're very different. I believe they're an immigration technology company that focuses on O1 visas, but they too started out as a marketplace. And so I also feel like I learned some lessons from them, because there were some overlap between what I was doing and what they were doing. They were just 10 steps ahead of me. Yeah.
It's great to know that in the space, right? Because then you can sort of learn from other people's mistakes and successes, frankly. Yeah. So at what point did you kind of move or decide to try YouTube, right? Because right now, your page, your YouTube channel is amazing. You have subscribers by the day, and thousands, tens of thousands of views per video, etc. Why did you try to do that after writing for so long?
So I love writing. I always have, but I wish I had done YouTube sooner. And I think the reason I didn't was bandwidth. And I think I was so caught up in doing things the way I was used to doing them, and a little, quite honestly, nervous to put myself out there publicly on video, right? There's a lot of trolling that happens on platforms like YouTube and other social media, and I wasn't quite sure. And immigration's a a hot topic. So I hesitated, but I had wanted to do it at least 2 years before I finally did it. And the reason was like, I keep up with what's happening in marketing, and Google is the largest search engine, but YouTube is the second largest search engine. And the other thing, the large difference is that not a lot of lawyers, not just immigration, but lawyers in general, were not using or leveraging YouTube effectively. There were very few channels a couple of years ago that talked about legal issues. And so I saw it as this huge opportunity. What LinkedIn is right now, right? I feel like all these platforms goes through phases of where organic reach is really powerful, and before they, make it more complicated and if it gets saturated. And so for law, I saw an opportunity on YouTube, and I thought I could reach more people because I was getting frustrated with Google. It is, I really enjoyed, and I felt like I hit a wall at some point with Google. And while I was still getting leads, I was like, well, ultimately my goal is to get more information to more people. So let me try YouTube. And so I think at the beginning of last year, so early 2020, I put up the first few videos, and, I stayed consistent, but my goal had been to put up one video a week, and I didn't stick to that. But I think last year I did probably 35 to 40 videos, and that garnered 750,000 views.
Wow.
Right. And the majority of the views, and this is what I tell people about YouTube, is they came in the second 6 months. So I posted an equal number of videos in the first 6 months as I did in the next 6 months. So it does take some time to build authority, but the kind of reach I have on YouTube, I could only dream of on Google, right? And it's a very similar audience. People are searching for immigration questions by the second on YouTube as well, right? And so, sorry, I just noticed my battery was low, and I was like, "Oh crap, is my computer going to die on me?" No, I think it'll last a little longer.
If you want to plug in, take a moment.
No, it's okay. We're wrapping up in about 10 minutes or so.
We'll see.
Oh, okay. Well, in that case, I apologize, but I'm gonna just plug in quickly.
I'll do a dance while everyone else is watching. If anybody out there has any questions, because we're going to start talking a lot more about YouTube. And, this is not going to be sort of a full-on show about YouTube. Maybe we'll do something like that in the future. But if you have any questions about YouTube best practices or, how to launch a channel or anything like that, throw them out here, because I think right now I'd love to mine Maneesha's experience and knowledge about YouTube, especially for the immigration industry. So throw in some comments, throw in some questions, and we'll see what happens.
Oh, sorry. My apologies. I thought it was already in here. Okay, I'm back. Okay. Where were we? We were talking about, how I landed on YouTube, right?
Yeah.
And, so I'm saying the kind of reach I was able to get on YouTube, I could have only dreamed of. And the most interesting thing is, if you look at my metrics now, actually 10% of those views on YouTube came from Google. So let's just let that sink in for a second. I was ranking on page 1 of Google results with my videos, right? And on topics that I would have never ranked for through Google.
Yep.
So I feel like it's a double win. I'd say 30% of my traffic comes from search, from people directly typing in a question or a phrase and then landing on my video in the search results. And then 50% or more of my views come from YouTube recommending my videos to viewers. And that's what takes some time to build up all of this. I think you just have to be consistent. The first 6 months, I saw healthy growth, but it was much slower. And then I'd say after June or July, it started to compound. And that's when I started to hit consistently 100,000 views a month.
Now, let me ask you this. When you started your videos, because I've looked at, I think, all of your videos, and they're all really good. Did you do a lot of research before you even put up video number 1 around best practices and camera quality and background and all that kind of stuff?
Yes, I did a lot of research, and I realized you don't need a whole lot to start. But I did do a ton. I spent a lot of time and energy to get to that conclusion, is that, and I still I only recently upgraded some of my equipment. So the entire last year, every single video you see on my channel is filmed with a $20 mic. $20 mic, and I happen to have like a 12-year-old DSLR, which is pretty good quality. So I've been using that. But if you don't have one, you certainly don't need to start with a fancy camera. And so really you need some audio lighting, and you could start a channel with maybe an investment of $100, $150, right? So it doesn't have to be expensive. I recently bought a very fancy mic that I haven't yet used, but that's because it was a present to myself because I wanted to elevate, the quality of my channel. But, I edited all my videos for the first 6 to 9 months, which I don't recommend if you have the resources to outsource that, because it's great to know how to do these things, but it is low value work. But the content creation, that's where I think immigration attorneys, should focus their energy. So I used to write a script for every single video. And so that I got really good at it. It would take me maybe less than an hour to write a script now. But in the very beginning, it was probably taking me a little longer. But I think that as attorneys who live and breathe immigration, coming up with the content is not the hard part. I think understanding how YouTube works and how you script for engagement so that people engage with your content, because on YouTube, people have about 15 seconds before you lose them. So if you don't start strong, they're never going to get to the rest of your great content. And so that's what I think the learning curve in YouTube really is, understanding how YouTube works. And instead of, if you just try to wing it and just throw on content, you'll waste a lot of time and also a lot of good content. So I think understanding how the metrics, what type of metrics, every platform is an algorithm, whether it's LinkedIn or Google, understanding what metrics on each platform work for engagement, what the algorithm rewards you for, and how to create content that kind of feeds into that algorithm. Those are the types of things, I spend my energy with clients on now, is helping them figure out this stuff. And some of the things you asked about, like, what should my setup be? What should my backdrop be? I think getting started is probably the hardest part, and getting into the groove of a workflow. So actually mapping out the workflow and who creates the thumbnails, and if you have the means to outsource some of that. So helping people build like a well-oiled machine so that they can do YouTube in as little time as possible. But with that said, it does take time, right? So that is the one thing I ask people, like when clients come to me or potential clients, is, do you have, if you want to do one video a week, which is what I usually recommend to start with, is be consistent, do one video a week. You do not need to do 2, 3, 4 videos a week unless you have the bandwidth. If you do it, doing 2 videos a week will certainly help your channel go faster than 1 video a week. But do I think it's necessary? No. It's a nice to have. And so to do that, I think you need at least 5 to 7 hours a week when you start to spare.
For one video.
Yeah. So like, think about it. I used to spend an hour to write the script, then an hour to film it. Then I would edit it myself, which I don't recommend. That would take me about 3 hours. And then there's some SEO work and stuff to upload it. So all in all, I'm spending about 5 hours of video every week. So that's about 20 hours a month. Now, you can very easily outsource some pieces of this so that, you sit in front of your camera, you record, and then let someone else take care of the rest of it. And so I ask people, before you even think about YouTube, who are you trying to attract? Like your customers or your clients? Who exactly are you trying to attract? Because if all you do is employment immigration, YouTube may not be the best place to be, right? LinkedIn is the best place to be if you're trying to attract corporate employers, right? So, but if you do a lot of family immigration, you do naturalization, so more, one-on-one work, individual immigration, then YouTube is an incredible source of leads. And so there, I do recommend people take a look at YouTube. But then the second thing to ask yourself is, what is your bandwidth like as a practice, both time-wise, but also money and resources, right? Like, are you able to outsource some pieces of the process? Because that would be the best thing to do. Some people that I've worked with have an in-house person that takes care of marketing, right? So in that case, I train those people on kind of the entire YouTube workflow management, all the tools, the software, everything you need to know, so that by the time I'm done working with that client, they have like an in-house process to do YouTube, right? So those are some of the things I think immigration attorneys need to think about. Very large firms already have this, have marketing teams, have this figured out, and quite honestly, very large firms have more money to spend on Google ads and paid search. But I'm really kind of, when I'm speaking here, talking to the solo practitioner or the small practice that wants to do more with marketing, but has limited time and a limited budget.
And also, there's also this idea of the desire to grow your brand in an organic way, where you're truly giving away a lot of really amazing information and building your brand that way.
Yeah, and I think when you're generous with your content and the information you give, it really comes back to you, right? It will. Look, YouTube is just like Google and other platforms. Like, just because I have thousands and thousands of views, I also get a lot of junk queries that, some of them don't even warrant a response. And so you also need some mechanism in place to kind of sort through what are good queries and good leads and what are not, right? And that can be time consuming too. So, I always say YouTube is a tactic, but you need to think about your marketing strategy a little more holistically. Like, how are we going to do all of this? Like, is YouTube the only platform we're going to be on, or are we going to pick one or two platforms to focus our energy? And then what do you do once you acquire the lead? Like, where does it go from there, right? Do I put them on an email list? Like, what am I doing with them, right? So YouTube is a tactic, but you really have to think about what to do before and after. And that's really kind of where I fit in with my work, my second, the non-AskEllis work that I'm doing these days.
Yeah, it's a strategy. I mean, you're helping folks place the YouTube marketing piece within their broader law firm growth. So we have a couple of questions coming in here. We actually have a particular one that's coming up twice. So Samir Kedekar asks on LinkedIn, do you do Facebook and Instagram too? And we have Anshu also ask, what are your thoughts on lives on Facebook and Instagram? So I think Samir was asking maybe more generally, are you also on Facebook and Instagram? So maybe we can talk about quickly those two platforms from a video perspective. Do you do them just as they are? And then how do you also feel about the live format?
Yeah, so I do not specialize in Facebook and IG. And, one of the mistakes I made with AskEllis in the beginning was trying to be on every platform at the same time. And again, I think it comes back to bandwidth and who you have running your marketing. Because if you have a marketing person, then it might make sense to be on multiple platforms. But I found I had the most success when I just kind of focused on one platform. And, I have found a lot of my audience on Google and YouTube. So for me, that's kind of really where I focused. And so I didn't personally have much success with growing my Facebook and IG in immigration. But then I also realized I really didn't need it, right? So I've become a very kind of avid proponent of focus on one or two platforms at a time. Once you master those, and then let me just backtrack for a second. If you have someone that can, whether in-house or a freelancer, that can help you be on other channels, you can certainly repurpose that content. And I think what you really just have to understand is how the content styles differ on each platform. So for example, I really discourage people from taking their Facebook lives and putting them on YouTube or podcasts, because that format that they're in does not do well on YouTube and it kills your watch time. So you just need it's not that the content isn't good, but it has to be presented in a different way on YouTube for it to work well. Like hour-long videos generally don't do well on YouTube, right? Like unless you're a famous entertainer, like people come to YouTube for entertainment or education. And so if you're educating, you do need to, on YouTube, you have to get to the point much faster. Whereas I feel like on live, conversations flow a little longer, they're a little easier. They're more kind of what you and I are doing right now. And so, but with that said, I also want to point out, like I have a client that works with foreign nurses, and in that case, they do have a Facebook group that's very active with foreign nurses. So foreign nurses outside the country apparently use Facebook a lot. And so I think that is something to take note of, like, where does your audience live? Like, yes, everybody's on Facebook and everybody's on Instagram, but if they're general queries, you don't need to be on every platform. You can find those same people that are on Facebook also on YouTube.
Exactly. It's like, what is their mindset when they're in a particular platform? If they go to youtube.com or whatever on their app, and they're going into the search bar, they might be searching for, how do I fundraise for my startup? You don't go and click and type in that query into the Facebook search bar. You'll type in, Maneesha Mukhi from high school. Oh, what is she up to, right? It's just you're in a different mind space when you're on these different platforms.
Yeah, and let's say you're a foreign nurse, you've joined a Facebook group to connect with other foreign nurses and see how people are navigating coming to the US, right? And so if there's a specific group that you specifically work with or are trying to attract, then it might make sense to have a group around that, right? So, but again, I don't specialize in Facebook and IG, so that's not something I work with clients on. I usually refer them to someone else to work on that.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. We've got another question here, kind of a technical. The H1B guy from YouTube asks, what are good numbers for click-through rates and average view duration? And I think these are kind of technical YouTube terms. Yeah. So Maneesha, can you kind of explain what is a click-through rate and what is average view duration on YouTube?
Yeah, so average view duration is, let's say you have a 10-minute video. What percentage of the video are people watching on average? So if you had 100 people on average, how much of your video did they watch? And so a good average view duration, you want to target 40% or more, right? And so when I started my channel, and actually this is a great question because these are two metrics you really, really want to track, because once you start creating content, if you're trying to understand what's working and what's not, that is one of the first things to look at. Like, are people only watching 20 seconds of my video and Xing out? Like, if a lot of people are doing that, there's something wrong with your intro or something in the way you're presenting the content. So always target 40% or more. With that said, 40% on a 10-minute video is really great. 40% on a 3-minute video is still 40%, but it's not as great. So the other thing is YouTube wants you to be on its platform as long as possible. Right? So my sweet spot of content tends to be videos between 5 and 10 minutes. But I always say it's not about the quantity, it's how much time you need to say what you need to say. Don't add fluff content. But also, if you think it's going to be a 30-minute video, I would chop it up into 2 15-minute videos. It's just a little easier to digest that way. And it's more likely to help your average view duration, because I think it's really hard for people to stay on for 30 minutes on the same topic. And now click-through rate, when you type in something in the YouTube search bar, say, naturalization process, like what are the steps? You'll get a bunch of search results, and some people will click on your thumbnail and some people won't. So they take a look at the total number of impressions of people that were presented with you in the search results. And of those impressions, so let's say they showed it to 1,000 people, what percentage of those 1,000 people actually clicked onto and went on to your video? Now, they may have clicked onto your video and then X'd out in 10 seconds. So the click-through rate doesn't capture that, but it captures that they at least took the first step and they clicked through. Mm-hmm. And now a good click-through rate, YouTube this is something shared by YouTube. They say on average, videos, more than half of the videos on their channels tend to have a 2 to 10% click-through rate. I'd say a good healthy click-through rate is more between 4 and 10, right? So I have videos that have 3% on the low end, and then on the high end, it can be 12%, depending on, and it also depends on how they're finding you, right? So click-through rate, it's not just in the search results. When you're on YouTube and you see, and you're watching a video and there are a bunch of suggestions in your sidebar. So the click-through rate there could be very different than a click-through rate in the search results, right? So you also have to factor that in. So sometimes I'm like, okay, it makes sense that I had a 4% click-through rate on this, but here I understand why I have an 8% click-through rate, because, well, it was presented on all the home screens of people on YouTube, and a lot of my subscribers probably clicked on it, which drove up my click-through rate.
Does YouTube differentiate between the click-through rate in kind of the sidebar versus a quick click-through rate in a search result, or no? Like, do you know which one is which?
So I don't. The click-through rate you get is a combination of everything. The number that they give you is like everything. Anytime it was presented anywhere. But if YouTube is continually pushing your content and people aren't clicking on it, that tells them, maybe, this topic and this person is not the best thing to recommend, right? And even within immigration, YouTube will start to kind of carve you into sub niches. Like I've noticed whenever I talk about passports or green cards, those videos tend to do better than when I talk about citizenship. And I think the reason for that is citizenship is more competitive on YouTube. And so my click-through rates tend to be lower because I'm just competing with, they're not bad, but they're relative to my other videos, they're lower. And just the last thing I want to say on that is, don't worry so much about getting thousands and thousands of views. Some of my least watched videos have brought me the most leads because of the type of content I've created, right? So I'd say when you create content, think about it this way. Some of your content is just to create brand awareness. It tends to be more broad. And so those types of videos will get more viewers, but you'll get a fewer number of leads from those. But those videos are also important and just so that people get to know who you are. Then you have people like in the middle who are aware of who you are and maybe they're considering a lawyer. They're somewhere in the middle stage. And so you have different type of content. And then you have at the very bottom kind of your high conversion content. It's a very specific person that you're targeting. For example, I might create a video. I wouldn't, but as an attorney, I could create a video on the O visa. There's a very specific kind of person looking for an O visa video. And usually an O visa is something you're not doing yourself, right? So the intention there to hire an attorney is probably much higher than it could be with like how to naturalize, because there you could do it yourself, you could hire an attorney. It's really up to you and your financial situation. But there are certain types of content that will naturally lead to more conversion. And so you want a little bit of everything on your channel, but know that, like, I know when I put certain videos that I'm not expecting like 20,000 views. I'm like, oh, if this video gets 3,000 views, that's really good, right? So
it's the same thing on LinkedIn. Honestly, it's also the high conversion, low view ones might also have an ask somewhere that's a little bit more blatant than a video that doesn't have that. So you can have something that's just fun or interesting, that's really shareable, maybe feel good content where you're just sharing something interesting. And then you have another one that, like you said, you're targeting someone specifically saying, here's a thing I have. If you're interested in it, please reach out. That's not something anyone's going to share with a bunch of their, colleagues or friends or family members, but it's something that if it speaks to them, they might really take that next step and call you or email you or whatever it might be.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the other thing I always tell people is make sure all your videos have some sort of call to action. Maybe it's that you're downloading a checklist and then that gives you their email address, or maybe it's scheduling a consult with you, but have some sort of call to action in your videos. And and that's part of kind of scripting for engagement. Like, where in your video should you place that, right? If on average people watch 40% of your videos, you want to get that in that first 40% then somewhere there, but not too early so that they don't drop off, right? So it's a little bit of and some of this honestly is trial and error. That's how I learned a lot of this, is trial and error. And the more videos you create, you will have more insights. Like, right, after some point, like, someone can teach you all they want about YouTube, but as you create more and more videos, your learnings are just naturally going to go up.
And there's going to be something that's unique to every single person. So you can have the best YouTube content, but if you don't have a lot of videos and a lot of data points, there's some insights that you're just not going to have.
Absolutely.
So the H-1B guy says currently on 19.4 and 5.2%. I guess that's the click-through rate. And view duration. So great stuff, H-1B guy.
Yeah, 2% is actually a very good click-through rate. So I think you need to look at, and YouTube, that's a great thing. When you go to the average view duration, you can actually see where people are dropping off. So take a look to see where if you're seeing a steep drop off in the very beginning, maybe it's your intro where you're losing people, right? So that's what I would recommend. Take a look at the chart that they show you in YouTube Studio, and it shows you like, it's like your line should be more like this, but if it's suddenly like this and then this, that tells you that, hey, people are dropping off in the first 30 seconds. Is my intro too long? Mm-hmm. Maybe it's somewhere else. So I think you can try to kind of investigate and figure out And then, is it certain videos that have lower retention than others? If you see a type of video working better, then I would double down on that topic and try to work your advantage there.
Yeah, great point. And again, to your earlier point, the more of these videos you have, the more you can start seeing trends of if people are dropping off at the same place over and over again, that's the place where you could put some energy. So I want to, as we kind of wrap up here, I wanted to ask you, number one, for you, right? When you say that you have conversion, what are you doing with the YouTube channel? So where are you sending people? What are you converting them into through the YouTube channel?
Yeah, at this point, I send them to the lawyers I know, those leads, the same 20. But also, I think through LinkedIn, I have a much larger network of attorneys. So if there's something that's not being catered to in that group, I'll ping somebody on LinkedIn that I know and send them there. So, at this point, I'm actually more focused on actually helping immigration attorneys, but I really love creating content and I love continuing to learn YouTube. So and that's the reason why I put out the content that I do. I think if I were an attorney, I don't have any videos on e-visas or O-visas or things like that, because I think those topics are better discussed by an attorney, right? So I tend to cover topics that are a little more broad, more process oriented, like what are the actual steps? And, and you hear me throughout my videos talking about, well, if you're in this complex situation, I highly recommend you speak to an attorney. So pretty much every video, I say it at least 5 times. If you're in situation XYZ, you should talk to an attorney. But if it's fairly straightforward, perhaps you can do it yourself. And so I think my end game with my channel is to continue to put out pretty broad information, but one-on-one type of information that people need, but also, I guess, Immigration 102. And then beyond that, I think this is where I really would like to empower attorneys to get out there, because, not only will it help them get clients, I think you're going to be able to reach and help people without, they may not turn into clients right away, but they'll tell other people about you, right? So it's a win-win situation where you're helping people that maybe don't have access to immigration services or don't have the financial means, but also it think about it as increases your chance of reaching more and more people.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the more lawyers you empower to reach people, the more immigrants or individuals you ultimately help with their kind of immigration journey. So, one last question, if I, was to end on something, is if folks want to reach you, where can they, or where should they reach you? I'll drop some links, for your YouTube page and such, but what's the best way to kind of reach out to you?
Yeah, I would say LinkedIn is great. I'm actually connected to quite a few immigration attorneys, but if I'm not yet connected to you, feel free to reach out to me. I love getting to know more people in the industry. And I'm not as frequent as Roman, but I do share some kind of wisdom and information on marketing here and there on LinkedIn. But also, you can check out my website, which is maneeshamukhi.com. And my email address is the same. It's maneesha@maneeshamukhi.com. So you can share my email address, Roman, if you'd like, and my website. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, absolutely. I'll do that. And I guess, my last question, just to kind of bring it back to one of the earlier things you said, do you have just a crazy memory of you being, when you were spending all of your years abroad and sort of really just traveling the world through your family's life? Do you have any kind of particular story that really sticks out that is indicative of that time in your life?
Oh, what kind of story? I have so many experiences and things in mind. Where are you going with this?
I'm just curious of what is something that is memorable for you from your time living in, Cote d'Ivoire
Yeah, well, honestly, I'd say my most memorable years were in Cote d'Ivoire.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It was my first time living in Africa. I think it was also very formative years, right? From the ages of 9 to 13. It's the most inclusive place I've ever lived in. And it was just when I look back to my experience of going to school there, I always feel really happy. And in fact, my oldest friend in the world is someone I met there and I'm still really good friends with. So we're going on to almost like 30 years of friendship. And so, I remember, okay, we had this, when my dad first got stationed there, I remember all of us were a little bummed out because we didn't want to go to Africa and we knew nothing about the continent or any countries there, right? So I feel like, like a lot of the world, we had a very kind of narrow view of what life was like there. And so I feel that I was really privileged that I got to go and live there and experience. And again, don't get me wrong, I was still the kid of an expat, right? So you still live in a little bit of a bubble, right? It's not the same as just like moving there and in a different way. So I still lived a very privileged life where I was in school with these other kids, but I just remember those were some of the happiest years of my life. And all the people I met were incredible. But also I think, I don't know, every country I've been to, there's something about every country I've lived in or been to that has stayed with me. And I always say, I feel like I'm part European, part Indian, part American, part African. Like I've picked up something from every culture that has stayed with me. And I think that's why I really like working in immigration, right? Yeah. It kind of all makes sense now to me when I look back as to how I landed here in immigration and specifically in content. Like, so when I was 5 years old, I used to record myself on a tape, on an audio cassette. And I was like, no wonder I'm so drawn to like talking and podcasting, because I used to teach teddy bears. Like, so I think from a very young age, I've enjoyed filling information gaps for stuffed animals. And I've always really been drawn to learning and being resourceful for others. And so I think that pattern followed me in every country I went to.
I love that. So if there are any teddy bears watching, reach out to Maneesha at maneeshamukhi.com for all of your.
As long as it's not Ted. Have you seen the movie Ted?
I have seen the movie Ted. That's right. Yeah, as long as it's not Ted, only nice, friendly teddy bears. Oh, that's so funny. I love that. Thank you for sharing that story. Thank you so much for being here. The H-1B guy, great stuff, Maneesha. Thank you.
Thank you.
Samir also said, awesome show. Thank you, Roman and Maneesha. Thank you again, Maneesha. This was so enlightening and interesting. And, it's so cool to see kind of how your life progressed from being global to being in the US and sort of going through this really arduous path of becoming an American citizen. And now that you're here, you're giving back to the global community in the way that you know best. And so I think everyone is, going to continue to learn a lot from you. And so I really appreciate you spending your time and sharing information with us.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. Honestly, I feel really grateful that I'm here. And I think, like I was telling my husband, like becoming a US citizen was probably one of the happiest days of my life, more so than getting married. And I was like, I think that's how deeply personal, like having roots is to me. So I'm glad I get to do this now.
And I think everyone feels the same. Alrighty. Oh, we've got, before we jump off, we've got a couple more. Sansari says, thank you. I need to catch the replay since I was in the wrong time zone. That's okay. Next time around. Definitely catch the replay. And again, connect with Maneesha on LinkedIn and elsewhere. And we have Julie Cap says, thank you both. Great info and conversation. Thank you so much, both. Anyway, again, thank you, Maneesha. I'll let you go now.
All right, thanks,
Thanks so much for being here. You too. Thank you. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining. That was such I have a million more questions about YouTube, so who knows? Maybe we'll do some follow-up videos and conversations with Maneesha about YouTube. But really appreciate everybody being here. I'm really excited to be back it's 2021. This was the first video of the year, and I have a lot of awesome guests lined up for months, and we'll continue to do this as long as I can. So appreciate all of you. And for the meantime,